On December 11, 2020, the House of Representatives sent the National Defense Authorization Act to President Trump for his signature. This legislation was the product of months of negotiation between the Democratic-controlled House and the GOP-led Senate, and represented a rare example of bipartisanship. The $740 billion spending bill was passed with overwhelming majorities in the House and Senate. Two parties vehemently opposed to each other, so opposed, in fact, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi basically called the 100-plus House Republicans traitors for signing on to the ridiculous Texas lawsuit alleging election fraud, came together to spend $750 billion on national defense. On January 1, 2021, Congress overrode Trump's veto of this defense bill, with plenty of room to spare on the two-thirds needed. The Pentagon is set to spend $2 billion a day in 2021. So, what's this have to do with evictions? Well, during another economic crisis in the late 1840s and early 1850s, caused by a contagion with foreign origins, the British Parliament came together to spend millions of pounds on a distant foreign war in the Crimea, a war fought for reasons totally remote from the daily misery experienced by the Irish people suffering under the burden not of COVID-19, but the even more deadly potato blight, with its origins in South America, that first afflicted Ireland's potato crops in 1845 and led to the death of approximately 1 million Irish men, women, and children. Poor Irish farmers relied on the nutritious and easy-to-cultivate potato, eating 5 to 10 pounds of potatoes a day. About 8 million people lived in Ireland, so you can imagine the loss and anguish most Irish families experienced as the potatoes rotted in the fields and their children starved. The British government spent £9.5 million on poor relief during the period of the famine, but around this same time spent £69 million prosecuting the Crimean War. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute and all that, I suppose. Both the US Congress and the British Parliament adopted these massive defense and military appropriations at a time when leaders in both institutions doubted the need or validity of helping millions of starving and struggling citizens cope with the devastating epidemic that drove them from their homes and deprived them of already meager incomes. Throughout the crisis, the conservative British press and elites complained incessantly about taxes to fund famine relief. It was justified with the usual calls made by out-of-touch and frankly cruel political leaders. Here's how The Economist in 1846 felt about providing poor relief to the Irish struggling with the potato blight. It will assuredly confirm the Irish people in those very habits of laziness, jobbing, and reliance upon others instead of themselves, which lie at the root of their permanent wretchedness. I'll let Mike Pence say it better.
They want to make rich people poorer and poor people more comfortable.
Welcome to another historically defensible claim by Mr. Green, eviction. What it must feel like to be in danger of losing your home. I've never had to face this catastrophic and anxiety-inducing personal crisis, but I deeply empathize with the millions of Americans confronting the scourge of eviction and the equally soul-crushing realization that those in power don't give a shit about you and your problems. Problems that were not of your own making. Problems made worse by a national government that bungled the response to a serious natural disaster at almost every turn. The pandemic threw millions of Americans already living on the economic margins into dire financial straits. Many lost their jobs in the retail and hospitality industries. This placed the 78% of American workers living paycheck to paycheck in a really tough situation. Housing costs are high in America and can consume 25 to 40% of household budgets. Now, I know what you'd say. The federal government halted evictions. President Trump boldly rushed in, not directly, of course, but through the CDC, to prevent evictions during a pandemic. But did he?
The moratorium is expected to impact 40 million renters nationwide who will be required to apply by showing substantial lost income this year, inability to pay full rent, and best efforts to pay partial rent. They'd also have to prove that eviction would leave them homeless or force them into crowded living conditions. And it applies to people who expect to make less than $99,000 this year.
Evictions continue apace, and I doubt those forced onto the streets take much solace in Trump's poorly enforced and in many cases empty moratorium. Local authorities and judges charged with interpreting this decree from the CDC often take the side of property owners. And in all of these, the landlords are dutifully protected and served by local sheriffs. Here's what the very compassionate sheriff of Chatham County, Georgia, has to say about struggling renters.
That's the thing I wanted to tell you about the evictions. It's got to go on. You know, people who own houses need to get their property back. They're paying taxes on them. The people for 5 months should have been able to come up with some kind of ordeal or something to help their self out to be where they wouldn't be evicted.
What a dick. But this isn't new. Let's travel back to potato famine Ireland. Most Catholic Irish were tenant farmers, owing their land and limited livelihood to rents paid to often absentee British landlords. Typically, these farms were too small to grow anything beyond the potato because of its efficiency in feeding a family. These landlords were usually served by local agents and backed up by the police and British Army. Ireland experienced 500,000 evictions during the potato famine. There are countless accounts from both Irish and British sources of these evictions. The agents of the landlord would turn up, and the Irish peasants would be forcibly turned out of their homes. Often their cottages would be knocked down, and there are many stories of emaciated families living in ditches on the side of the road, awaiting death from starvation or disease. In one account, reprinted from the Dublin's Freeman Journal and the London Illustrated News, the sheriff, the police, and a large force from the 49th Regiment evicted the residents of 61 cottages, all but one of which was demolished. Here's a description. Women, young and old, running wildly to and fro with small portions of their property in order to save it from the wreck. The screaming of children and wild wailings of mothers driven from home and shelter, their peaceful homes, hallowed by 1,000 fond recollections, all combined to form a picture of human misery such as the darkest imagination alone could realize. But many times these clearances were praised as a more efficient use of land for the raising of livestock. This one particular eviction in Roscommon on March 13, 1846, ironically the date around which most COVID-19 lockdowns began in the USA, left about 270 people homeless and destitute, their lives shattered forever, while cattle used their former farms as pasture land to more efficiently enrich the landowner. Charles Trevelyan, the British official responsible for famine relief, had almost total contempt for the Irish peasants and believed that their over-reliance on the potato was the doom of Ireland, and Irish farmers needed to be shocked into more productive work. He said, "They must still depend for their subsistence upon agriculture, but upon agriculture conducted according to new and very improved conditions." Trevelyan's cold capitalist calculus makes him one of the most hated men in Irish history. The law in most states heavily favors landlords, as it did in 19th century Ireland. In a state like Texas or Florida, one can be evicted for missing only 1 month's rent. For example, in Pensacola, Florida, Judge Patricia Kinsey deemed the CDC's eviction moratorium unconstitutional and has ordered evictions in Escambia County. Judges in other states have adopted a similar position, siding with landlords, some of whom are foreign-owned corporate conglomerates, and the sheriff will dutifully show up to run your ass out. In Ohio, a 39-year-old woman was evicted despite proving an impact to her income from COVID and paying her rent. The late payment was grounds enough to give her the boot. The landlord's agent, unhappy with the pace of her packing, just threw her shit on the lawn in front of her townhouse. She got some charity help to find a new place, but good luck getting an apartment with an eviction on your record. She was living in her car with her boyfriend and daughter as of December 2020. As eviction moratoriums end and missed rent payments mount, this situation will only worsen as landlords look to relist apartments no longer generating income. About 10 to 14 million renter households are behind on their rent, and back rent is piling up. Estimates put it around $17 billion in the fall of 2020, and this number will only continue to rise. Smaller mom-and-pop landlords, under pressure from missed rent payments, may sell out to the larger real estate companies that will likely convert affordable housing into luxury condos and apartments. About 80% of the 371,000 new rental properties that hit the market in 2020 were luxury housing, according to Time magazine and the real estate analytics firm RealPage. Spot the similarities? The government in both cases, despite some token efforts and lip service, is, in practice, far more interested in serving the goals of property owners despite the human costs of eviction. Grudgingly provided aid and charity are not sufficient, and the many Americans that have retained their homes for now face a mountain of back rent and the looming threat of eviction. Landlords have already filed 150,000 eviction notices nationally as 2020 came to a close, and that number will likely balloon in 2021. The GOP-led Senate did everything in their power to deny survival payments to struggling Americans, while ensuring the spigot remains turned on for the military, just like the British Parliament did. Then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell only relented, approving a whopping $600 per American in relief in the vain hope of saving the GOP Senate majority. Even liberal Democratic senators like Dick Durbin insisted this National Defense Authorization Act is necessary because the bill includes a number of provisions I authored and supported, including expressing strong support for the Baltic states in the Ukraine, especially in the face of continued, unforgivable Russian aggression. I mean, this seems like a noteworthy goal, I guess, but the fact is this defense law and its $740 billion in spending does little for the 25 million Americans staring down the barrel of eviction. Just as I'm sure the Irish subjects of Queen Victoria that were turned out of their homes by the British Army during the potato famine could give a fuck about Russian expansion in the Black Sea region. I bet the families in Georgia, Florida, and Ohio, with their possessions scattered on the front lawn and their children crying, don't care too much about Tsar Putin's plans for the Crimea. Reflecting on the potato famine in 1861, Irish nationalist John Mitchell said, "Now that 1.5 million men, women, and children were carefully, prudently, and peacefully slain by the English government, they died of hunger in the midst of abundance which their own hands created." That is the cruel fate looming for so many Americans, being thrown on the streets during a pandemic and economic crisis. COVID-19 has struck all over the world, but many other Western nations have stepped in to prevent mass evictions and the problem of back rent, largely by subsidizing their workers with direct payments and unemployment insurance, both allowing renters to pay on time. The failed response to the potato famine and the British government's complicity in mass evictions, despite the many noble sacrifices made by individual officials and landlords in Ireland, has long been a prominent stain on the already pretty muddy reputation of the British Empire. Let's not repeat that mistake. To paraphrase Mitchell, the Almighty indeed sent the coronavirus, but the U.S. government created the eviction crisis. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. This has been another historically defensible claim from Mr. Green. Thanks, and see you next time.